Matt Gorham. I lead the Cyber and Privacy Innovation Institute at PwC, and a lot of the work I do is talking to boards and C-suites about what does the cyber threat landscape look like, how should you think about it, how should you posture to defend against it, how should you engage with the federal government as it relates to cyber. And that's based largely on the fact, until about 3.5 years ago, I'd spent the previous 25 years at the FBI. My last job there was as the Assistant Director of Cyber. So in FBI speak, person responsible for all cyber investigations and operations. And still, I'm on the U.S. Secret Service advisory panel for their director for cyber investigations as well. So very much come at this from a threat perspective. The topic today is the SEC cyber rule, and so I want to talk a little bit about what that rule is trying to achieve, and then really delve down into the practical application of what does that mean for the CISO in an organization. I've probably talked to about 150 clients, helping them work through how to think about the rule, what they need to do in preparation for the rule, and what we've seen since the rule has been implemented last December, and then what they did well before December, before the implementation, after the rule was finalized. So first and foremost, what does the SEC do? One of the things that the SEC needs to focus on is the protecting investors. That's one of the three key things that the SEC does. And in that vein, what they're trying to do here is say, we want some type of consistent and comparable information about cyber programs, because what we've seen, this is from the SEC perspective, what we've seen over the years is not consistent. It's not easy for the reasonable investor to compare information when making investment decisions, right? And so what they're trying to do is really, again, make it consistent and comparable across all these disclosures. Now, the disclosure itself, what does the rule require you to do? We're going to break it in a couple of pieces. The first is around material cyber incidents. That is, you had an incident, you've determined that it is a material incident, which means from that point you've made that determination around materiality. You have 4 days to describe the nature, scope, timing, material impact, or reasonably likely material impact, and get that out on an Form 8K. We'll talk a little bit about that. But on that kind of piece of the rule, I want to talk about 3 levels, and I'm going to come back to this and go into some depth. The first is at the top of the CISO organization. That is, what are you escalating from the CISO organization to the disclosure committee? The disclosure committee being that management team that has the responsibility to make the dispositive determination around materiality. Is this a material incident or not? Then there's the actual determination piece. How's that disclosure committee function? And the third is the disclosure itself, getting it out the door in that 4 days. And then we're going to talk about the second piece of the disclosure, which is the annual disclosure. That's the 10K. That is describing your cybersecurity strategy, your process for making sure you have that risk assessment, and then governance. So how are you doing the governance, particularly at the board level? And we'll talk about that as the second piece of the rule. So let's start with the material incident disclosure. So you were responsible for disclosing material cyber incidents before the SEC cyber rule. It's not new. There was 2011 interpretive guidance out there that said this is how we apply materiality to cyber. There was 2018 staff guidance telling you had to do all the same things that you have to do today without that 4-day window. And so it's not a new process, but there are a couple things that are areas of focus that we need to pay attention to. The first is around aggregated incidents. And so that is incidents that if you looked at them individually, they're not material. But if you aggregated those incidents together, become material. So before we talk about those, what's the definition of material, right? And so we use, in this context, the Supreme Court securities law definition of materiality. That is, what would the reasonable, prudent investor think if you put this information or left it out in the total mix of information out there would be important? That is, what is it they should know when making investment decisions? Now, with respect to those individual incidents that are immaterial, you have an incident, how do you aggregate those? probably two primary ways that you think about that. The first is same vulnerability. So you had a vulnerability, you didn't know about it, a couple of different threat actors leveraged that, got into your systems, you detected it, you evicted them, case closed. You have that vulnerability. You need to escalate them all up together and consider them in totality, in the aggregate, to determine if they're material. Again, the materiality decision is both a qualitative and a quantitative assessment. That is, it's not just about that financial number, it's also a quality review. We'll come back to that. The second way an incident could be related is same actor. Everybody knows attribution is much more of an art than a science, and so the SEC did not provide clear guidance of how we determine attribution. It is the same actor, but you need to make some assessments of how you do that internally for the purposes of aggregating those incidents. And so imagine the example that you had an incident in September, they got into your systems, you detected them, you evicted them, you escalated that particular incident, you determined it was not a material incident, and then in November, same actor came back in, got into your systems. Individually, you look at that one, and you say it's still not material, but you need to put them both together and determine in the aggregate, are those two incidents material? And so the question for the CISO is, do we have the right processes in place to capture that? To make sure that we're going to escalate in a package that is aggregated if it's the same vulnerability, and do we have the ability to capture over time whether it's the same actor and put those together? And then the third piece is, what happens, because we all know information becomes available down the road about the incident. And so you had an incident in September, you escalated it, you said it's not a material incident. In March of the following year, some new information becomes available. Do you have processes in place that captures that new information, marries it back up with the original incident, and then re-escalates that for a reevaluation if necessary? And so the real question is, do I have all those processes in place? And do I capture everything for escalation that could potentially be material? So if I'm a CISO, what I want to do is have a conversation between three primary people. The first is the CISO organization. The second is the CFO comptroller. The third is the general counsel. If you imagine a triangle, and each one of the corners of the triangle is one of those organizations, it's about shrinking the size of that triangle. The closer you are together and your understanding of what is important to be escalated for consideration around materiality, the better off you'll be. And so it's about working together, because I don't want to make those decisions about what potentially could be material and my determinations around escalation without that input. As a CISO, I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable, that the disclosure committee feels like they're getting everything they need. And some of that will go to, we're not going to escalate the following things. You want them to say, and we're comfortable with that those escalation rules, so that we're not seeing this kind of particular information. The next level up is the disclosure committee itself. And so that is, what we're seeing is CISOs added to that disclosure committee, if they weren't already on that disclosure committee, particularly as it relates to cyber incidents, so that they have input into that disclosure process. I think the difficult piece of this is a lot of companies didn't necessarily have well-documented processes that contemporaneously evidence that decision, right? And so there's a lot of work around that. Why? Well, no one expects the SEC to come back and say, you said this incident was material, but we don't actually think it is. But what we do expect them to say is, we know you had an incident, we didn't see a material incident disclosure, show us your math. And so that ability to say, here's the process by which we use to make this determination, here are the facts and circumstances in this particular case, and this is why we made that determination. And so making sure we have that. We're not seeing companies build a whole new process around making these determinations. They're using their existing disclosure committees. They're just augmenting with people appropriate to the cyber conversation. And then the last level is the actual disclosure itself. Remember, the SEC put no time from the time the incident occurred to make that determination. Think ransomware. Think how long it's going to take to really have a good assessment. You're waiting on the third-party forensics firm. You're waiting for the negotiators to get proof of possession, proof of decryption. You're going to try to do some in conjunction with that, some data quantification. There's a lot of factors you don't know what the answer is around materiality. So everybody recognizes that's going to take some time. But once you make that call, now you have just 4 days to get it out. Again, nature, scope, timing, material impact, reasonably likely material impact. That sounds like a long time because you've already made that determination, but to get all the wordsmithing around disclosure language, to get all the approvals required and get it out the door isn't as simple as it seems. And so there's a lot of work going on around that. And now what's the key to all three of these things in that stack? Conversations among particularly that triangle and shrinking that triangle. And then secondly, exercising all of those. Meaning, come up with a handful of scenarios and say, would we escalate this? And could it potentially be material? Work through the process of a determination around those scenarios. Would we say this is material or not, both from a quantitative and qualitative perspective? And how would we wordsmith to get this out the door? And so we see a lot of that exercising, just internal. Not bringing a third party in to do it for you, just doing it yourselves. Work through those and have those conversations so you're not trying to figure it out in the middle of the incident. Because all of you that have been through incidents know you're dealing with the incident, you're dealing with the auditors wanting to talk about SOX and your ICFR data and everything dealing with that. You're having to deal with the disclosure. That's a lot of things going on at the same time. So if you, just like exercising in any other domain, if you do it ahead of time, it'll be easier to accomplish when you're actually there. So let me jump over from the 8K, that incident disclosure, to the 10K. When the rule came out, everybody was focused on the 8K. Even though you were already responsible as a public company to disclose material incident already. But it was a lot of process, working through those things I just described. And nobody was really, intently focused on the 10K, because I think the thought was, hey, we're gonna pull some things out of our proxy statement, some things out of our risk factors, we're gonna have to write some net new. But from the proposal to the final rule, they kind of lifted it up a level. So if you remember, if you saw the proposal, they were down in the weeds and there were a lot of comments around we're providing the adversaries roadmaps to get into our systems. And so they really lifted it up a level to what's your cybersecurity strategy? What are your processes you have in place from a risk assessment perspective, and how do you do governance? So most companies were pretty comfortable. I think the thing that changed that was the SEC action around SolarWinds. And from a CISO perspective, what that caused was some considerations for the CISO. The first is around director and officers insurance and indemnification. You saw a lot of CISOs wanting to have that so that if they're going to be called out individually liable around decisions around disclosure, that they had some protection. The second is, if you think how most CISOs are engaged in that writing of the disclosure, they're often there at the front end. That is, they're providing information. They're saying, here's our cybersecurity strategy, here are the processes we have in place, here's a description of our program, and then it goes into a process of developing that disclosure. And so the next thing I saw with a lot of CISOs is, I want to see it at the back end. Why? Because with wordsmithing and processing that, it may change the overall understanding. Now remember, the SEC hasn't said that you have to have a program. What they've said is you have to accurately describe the program you have. There can't be a difference between what you know to be true privately and what you publicly disclose. And so the question the CISO should ask themselves on the back end of that disclosure is, have we undersold the risk and oversold our capability? Particularly if you're a company that your security is foundational to your competitive advantage and you have all this marketing material out there, you have a disclosure that's kind of painting a picture of a very robust defensive system, but you know privately that that's not accurate, that you don't have those things in place, or they're not the way you've described those, or you've somehow really diminished the threat of what this could look like and the impact that threat would have on the business. And so those are the kinds of questions that a CISO on the back end of that disclosure, before it goes out, I see CISOs saying, I want to review that. I want to be able to say, hey, this no longer represents what I know to be true in private. Does that make sense? So I'm going to pause there for a minute. And are there any questions on the 8K or the 10K and the conversations in terms of preparation for the implementation? No questions whatsoever. Okay. Yeah. There's not a template. I would say we're 3/4 of the way into the year, and so late filers are looking at everything we've seen. And I'll talk, we took a look at the first 200 10Ks that were filed. And what we've seen is some consistency. So we've consistently seen companies identify a CISO or CISO-like individual in the organization. We've consistently seen companies referring to some framework, NIST, ISO, and the like. We've consistently seen companies describe how they've implemented cybersecurity into their overall risk process. That's on the 10K. We've also consistently seen a description, and we've seen this play out in reality as well, of a shift from the CISO meeting with a board, for example, once a year, to it's certainly more often the case it's quarterly, and we've actually seen some boards meeting with the CISO on executive session. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is to build that relationship between the CISO and the board in the furtherance of developing the relationship to be able to translate technical cyber risk into business risk. Probably the most difficult thing between a board and a CISO is to close that gap. And so having those kind of executive sessions, having those one-on-one conversations without anybody else in the room allows the board to ask those probing questions, allows the CISO to answer questions like, what was the last thing on your resource request that wasn't provided, and what's the impact of that? And those kind of more provocative questions that can really tease out a better understanding of that risk. On the 8K side, again, no templates, but what we've seen is a couple of things. The first was a shift from I think it's a shift in mindset, and I will say, let me say this first, I'm not sure this is a result of the SEC rule in part or whole, or a shift in the thought process around ransomware incidents. So if we go back a couple of years, companies are very concerned from a reputational perspective, and remember, reputation is something you have to consider in the qualitative assessment around materiality. They were very concerned about that from being the victim of a ransomware attack. Today, so many companies are the victim of a ransomware attack. I think many companies are less concerned about the reputational impact of being a victim than they are about how they responded to that ransomware attack, particularly if it's a ransomware attack that impacted your operational capability, right? And so what we've seen is companies being more transparent as a result, trying to push out, hey, here's how we're responding, here's the things we're doing. And companies began to use the 8K as a strategic messaging document, a public comms document to say, hey, we've had this cyber incident. It's not material, because this is the result, a non-material 8K disclosure. And so we've seen a number of companies doing that on the run-up to the implementation of the rule, and then even subsequently. So much so that in June, the SEC came out and said, hey, don't put any more non-material cyber incidents filed on the 8K for material cyber incidents. Put that in the other category because the cyber rule is designed in this form to capture a material cyber incident. And what you're saying is it's not a material cyber incident. And if you feel like you want to disclose it, even if it's not because you still think it could become material down the road, still put that in the other category until you make that determination around materiality. Don't file it under the material 8K. And so while there aren't templates, to answer your question, I think there are a number of examples that you can look at to kind of get an idea of what that should look like. In terms of depth. And a lot of the questions, particularly on the 10K, go to how much should I put there? I don't want to create a roadmap for the adversary, but the SEC has clearly indicated there can't be boilerplate language as well. I think the key to that is it's probably a couple of pages long. You're not seeing these things over that 2-page kind of description of what that looks like, and you're seeing it at a very high level. I think particularly this first year. The SEC kind of, I think, understands that the first year is going to be a growing year. Everybody's trying to figure out what that looks like. We'll see with this next year. After December, we'll have a full year of 10Ks out there, and we'll start to see those comment letters to refine what that looks like. But I think it's largely achieving what the SEC was intending it to do. That is, you have one particular place in a 10K disclosure you can go and look at that says, here's the cybersecurity strategy, here's the processes, here's the governance. So you can say, when I'm making my investment decision, I can look here and get a sense of this company. And here are the 8Ks, so if they've had a material cyber incident, here's where I can go and take a look at what that impact was, again, so I can make my investment decision. And it probably goes a little further because of all those non-material cyber incidents that in the past may not have been disclosed. And again, not sure if that's driven by the SEC cyber rule or it's just an opportunity to message using that vehicle, or whether it's a change in perspective around ransomware. But for either reason, there are more of those disclosures that are taking place. Again, collaterally more beneficial to the investor? Arguably, yes. Other questions? Yes. So the question was, is it only applicable to public companies? And the answer is yes. I'm going to put a but on that. But it's anybody who's a registrant under the 1934 Act, thus a public company, is responsible for responsible for being in compliance with the rule. That said, there are private companies, and I have a number of conversations with private companies that look to what a public company has to do to drive the way they do things. And so while it's not applicable to them, it's an area that they look at to try to emulate the activity of a public company, just out of a kind of their own due diligence for themselves and trying to be the same way compliant with the rule. Other questions? No? Yeah.
What about international companies that are cross-listed in the U.S. on the SEC or and thus potentially regulated? I know there are some different forms that they fill out.
Yeah. So there are companies that we refer to as FPIs, or foreign private issuers. So that is, they do not fall under the same thing as a registrant under the 1934 Act, but they are required to file forms. On the annual disclosure, instead of a 10K, it would be a 20F. On the 8K, the material incident, it's a 6K, not an 8K. There are some differences. I would tell you that the 20F form is very consistent with a 10K. The kinds of things that you would expect to see in a 10K, you would expect to see in that 20F as well. I think the differences come with respect to the 6K, 8K differences. And there's all, I would defer to the lawyers representing any particular company what you put in there. But basically what the rule says is a foreign private issuer, I'm going to make up a fact pattern, but maybe registered in the UK on an exchange there. If in the UK they have to file a material cyber incident disclosure, then they would be required to do it on that 6K form for the SEC as well. It's not a direct comparison because there are different definitions of materiality. The disclosure requirement in the country where they're hosted on that exchange may be slightly different. And so it's a fact and circumstance dependent decision each and every time. It's not an easy one to describe because you have to describe it for each and every exchange and company and country involved. But those are the differences between a foreign private issuer and one that's a registrant under the 34 Act in the United States.
Hi there. What about for companies that are impacted by downstream or upstream vendors or partners? Do they also have that same requirement to file? And a second part of the question is, what about as it relates especially to, as the gentleman mentioned, international companies?
Yeah, so you need to think about the rule, and when you think about the cyber rule and they talk about an incident, what they're really talking about is the kind of traditional CIA triad. So if you've had that impact internally, so let's talk third parties. You have a third party with connections to you. The first question to ask is, has the incident that third party had propagated to our systems? If the answer is no, a third party has had the incident, we have not. You have to make all the decisions you need to make about severing the connections and the like. But if it's not propagated to your system, you do not have a cyber incident reportable under the SEC cyber rule. That said, you still may have a reportable material incident depending on what impact that third party has on your supply chain. So it is potentially possible that it's still a material incident, but again, not under the cyber rule. If that third party has the incident, whether it is material to them or not, and it has propagated to your systems, now you have a cyber incident, and you have to make that determination around materiality, divorced from whether they have a material cyber incident or not, because now you have a cyber incident, and you have to go through that entire escalation and determine whether it's material, if so, nature, scope, timing, material impact, reasonably likely material impact. And so that would apply whether that was a domestic company or a foreign company, again, because it's really pretty clean. If it's propagated to our systems, it's our incident. If it's on their systems and it has not propagated, it's not reportable under the cyber rule. But again, it could still be material just under a different materiality rule that you may have to disclose. And so those are the conversations that you want to have. And I think the conversations we have with a lot of companies around that are the same conversations everybody's having around third-party dependencies. And how do I have that good inventory of what connections and dependencies I have? What's the SLA from that third party say about notifying me? Am I going to get that notification to the extent a company's willing to exercise that with you so that you know, in fact, it's going to come into your SOC. This is how it's going to come in, as opposed to a cell phone call to the deputy CISO who's on vacation and didn't get it. Like, how does that process look like? And then what's that look like internally for the CISO organization about making determinations of whether you need to sever connections or what action you need to take as a result of that third-party incident. So those are all things, again, that companies are working through today. What other questions?
So, what are ramifications? For instance, if a company fills out the compliance paperwork and maybe it's embellished, more grandiose than the current situation, which I think probably a lot of companies, have what they have, and the CISO sees it maybe differently. And there were a cyber incident. What are the ramifications? Like, who's checking the paperwork? Who's verifying that? How does all that work?
So,
Or is it too new?
no, I think it is new in this respect. The rule itself is new, and the significant increase in the enforcement division at SEC new as well. And so with the new rule came new enforcement resources from the SEC. And so my expectation is we will see more enforcement action around that moving forward, and they have the ability to investigate, subpoena, and I think one example of that we've seen is the SEC action against SolarWinds. Now, the SEC has had some setbacks in court as of late with respect to that, but I think that's the direction we're continuing to see is the new rules in place. Here are the kind of enforcement actions that we'll see, which are we're going to come in, we're going to look at it. We know you had an incident. Was it material or not? I think one of the things on the 10K, and this is going to go to a connection with the 8K. So say you had an incident, you had your 10K filed. To your point, maybe it's underselling the risk, overselling capability. You had this incident that you determined is not material, but is public, either because in a separate channel you've messaged it publicly to be transparent with your clients, or because it was a series of incidents and it was publicly outed, or a researcher outed it, for whatever reason the SEC knows about it. And they come back and say, we know you had an incident, show us your math of why you didn't think this was a material incident. They're certainly going to look at that incident around materiality, but then they're going to track that back to your 10K and say, well, you said these things in your 10K, but clearly as a result of how this incident played out, these things may not be accurate. And so that's where you're going to see action by the SEC to say, on the 10K, you said these things which are, and there is a difference between what you knew privately. Remember, they have subpoena power, so they're going to look at all the emails and everything associated with it, and then they're going to go back and say, and this 10K still may not be material, but it took us to the 10K where we saw disclosures. Remember, the SEC does not say you even have to have a program. What they say is, for investors to be able to make good investment decisions, you need to accurately describe the program you have. And so it's about accuracy, less about how good your program is. Certainly over time, there will probably be collateral impact as companies begin to look at, hey, having all the basics in place, having a program that's strong may give us some competitive advantage in the market, and so we want to have that. But I think initially it's just going to be about, is it accurately described? And maybe over time we'll start to see that escalation of the overall programs as a result. Any other questions before I jump into exercising in general? Okay. So what does this all mean for the CISO beyond what we've talked about today? And what recommendations do I have based on what I've seen from what companies are doing? The first thing I would say is you should exercise this. And maybe the first way you exercise that is just as I was talking about before. That is, get that triangle together, have the CFO, comptroller, the GC, CISO CIO organization come together and say, hey, we're going to do a chalk talk through what this would look like to make sure everybody's comfortable with it, what's getting escalated, comfortable with how that disclosure determination is made, and that we can get it out the door. That's a pretty easy lift once you get everybody together just to talk it through. The next thing is put this into your regular exercise program. So let's use ransomware as the example. So if I look at all the ransomware incidents I've seen play out, whether I was in government or in the private sector, I would say the companies that fared better than others did a couple of things. The first thing they did is they did the basics well because it took themselves out of that first tranche in the targeting process, who's easily targetable. Allowed them to better detect it, contain it if it happened. But of those that actually had the detonation, the companies that fared better planned well. So they had a good IR plan, crisis management, disaster recovery, business continuity plan. But if you think about your organizations, in many organizations, those are developed in some isolation. And so the next thing they did is they exercised those plans at the operational level to make sure they didn't work at cross purpose. The next thing they did is they exercised it at the executive level, both to make sure it didn't work at cross purpose, but more importantly, to refine and shrink the decision space to give yourself more agility during the time of the ransomware incident. So think through a ransomware incident. 4 broad areas that you can make a lot of progress. Because ransomware actors, traditionally going to put that 72-hour window over top of you, because they know you can't possibly get fulsome answers to your questions in 72 hours, particularly if you never asked them before. So asking those questions ahead of time in 4 broad buckets allow you to shrink and refine that decision space. First area is communications, internal and external. Who's going to say what to whom? What are they going to say? When are they going to say it? If your enterprise systems are down, how are you going to communicate it? How are you going to communicate it if they're up? Because you should be asking yourself why they're still up too, right? And so, second area, the pay no pay decision. Wrestling with things like, does paying a ransom align with our corporate values? If no, are there occasions we would pay it anyway? What are the factors we would consider? What's the process that's made in? And ultimately, who owns that decision? Because you don't want to try to figure that out in the middle of the incident. The third is the value proposition around law enforcement contact. Am I going to call? Who's going to call? What expectations do we have? What expectations does law enforcement have or other government agencies? And the third, or the fourth area is around what, when, and how to tell the board, particularly around the 3 areas of board interest. That is what you're going to disclose to the markets, the pay no pay decision, and any kind of trading halts or blackout periods you need as a result of the incident, which is also in the SEC cyber rule. And then lastly, the companies that fared the best exercised with the board in some form or fashion. The way I've seen it done the best is that second truncated executive tabletop exercise where the board plays the part of the board. Management summarizes that tabletop exercise that they did and the learning points. They then turn to the board and say, this is when we would tell you, this is what we would say. And then they engage in that dialogue to set expectations. So the board knows this is what the board's going to do in an incident. This is what management's role in the incident is. And so the companies that did that generally fare better than others. And so what I would recommend based on that is after you've done the chalk talk and worked through that you have everything you want to have in place, I think that second exercising opportunity is as you do your next ransomware tabletop exercise, incorporate decisions around that disclosure into that exercise. Talk through, this is the incident we have. How would it get escalated? What are the things around it that would get escalated? How's the disclosure committee going to come together and make a determination? How is that documented? Is it documented contemporaneously? How long are we going to retain those records? If that is in fact something that would be determined to be material, how would you get that out in 4 days? Draft the disclosure as part of that tabletop exercise. I think that's a really good thing to do so that you've gone through that once in a practical setting where you have the latitude to talk through it without the pressure of an actual incident. I would not recommend doing that without having done that first chalk talk first, because it'll add a level of complexity that might derail your tabletop exercise. But I think if you do those 2 things sequentially, that you'll see a lot of benefit in that. Remember, as a CISO, you're going to have a million things going on at the same time. So knowing that those processes are in place and those decisions have already been made, I think puts yourself in a much better position. Any questions on any of that? I know it's an incredibly dry topic for a lot of CISOs, but I do think there's risks for CISOs out there in terms of making sure that you're protected, you're making sure that the disclosures that are going out are consistent with what you know to be true, that you have everything in place that you need to be able to report material cyber incidents when they occur. And if there are no other questions, one more right here.
Sorry, you were just going so quickly. Your 4th point, what, when, how to communicate to the board.
Mm-hmm.
And you had 3 subpoints: disclosure to the market, something, and then blackout trading periods.
Pay or no pay. Yeah, boards are very interested in the pay no pay decision. And so I think it's really important for the board to understand what that escalation looks like around pay no pay. And I would say you don't need a policy whether you would pay or not. You just need to know how that decision's being made. And so that's not being litigated. If I would argue if you have a position that we will never pay, you haven't seen every fact and circumstances that may drive you to that decision, and so it's not necessarily beneficial to you to have that. But it's very beneficial to know this is the process, here are the occasions we might, here are the factors we consider, and ultimately who owns that decision. Sometimes you do, I've done exercises with companies that haven't had that defined, and that turns into a big argument about who actually is making that decision, who's providing input versus making that decision. Where is the board in that decision? And so having the board understand clearly whether that's thresholds that management has in terms of making the payment, whether that's board concurrence with the payment, just knowing how all of that takes place, I think goes a long way to giving board confidence in management's ability to navigate the scenario. And that's really what you're looking for with that board, is giving them enough information for their oversight responsibilities and giving them confidence in management's ability to navigate a ransomware incident when it takes place. Last point on, and I know I talked through ransomware as the exercise. The reason I would say it's good to attach to a ransomware exercise is, as you all know, that oftentimes covers the largest swath of the organization and business impact because you have a potential data theft, you have an operational outage, so it is a good one to use. You could certainly do it with another type of scenario, but I think that's a really good one to do it with. Any other questions before we close out? All right, I will stick around if there are any kind of sidebars you want to have, but thanks for coming today. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.